In the spring of 1994, every farmer in Huron County, Ontario, laughed at Kathleen Sorrel. They laughed at the co-op on Goderich Line. They all laughed over the counter at the feed store in Wingham. They laughed in the parking lot of St. Andrew's Presbyterian after the Sunday service. They laughed at the grain elevator in Clinton and at the Dairy Dell, where the men with the older hands sat on stools every morning at 7 and drank coffee that was always too strong. Kathleen Sorrel had attended a soil conference in Guelph and come back with a plan nobody in the county could make sense of. She was going to stop plowing. Not just one field, not just the south quarter, where the clay ran heavy and the tractor always bogged down in April. Every field. All 480 acres of the Sorrel farm outside of Blythe. She was going to leave the stubble standing, seed, directly into the residue, and let the soil do what she was convinced it already knew how to do. The county had a word for it. Grief. Her husband, Dennis Sorrel, had died in the January of 1992. Angina. Then a second attack before the ambulance reached the highway. He was 51 years old. He had left her the farm, the debt, a 1987 John Deere 42, 250 with a cracked rear glass, and a grain bin that had been leaning 3 degrees south since the ice storm of 1989. And now the widow Sorrel, 44 years old, was talking about no-till. They laughed for 2 seasons. Then they laughed for 4 more years. They stopped laughing in the summer of 2000, when the driest July in 43 years turned the topsoil of Huron County into a fine powder that blew off the fields in visible clouds and settled on windshields and windowsills 20 miles away. When the farmers, who had worked the same land as their fathers and their fathers' fathers, watched the surface of their fields lift and move in the wind, and when somebody noticed something, there was one farm on the 6th concession of Hulett Township where the wheat was still standing, where the soil under the stubble was dark and held together when you pressed it in your fist, where the field that the whole county had called a mistake was, in that dry summer, the only field in the area that made any sense at all. Let Kathleen Sorrel take you back 6 years. Let her show you what she decided. Let her show you who laughed. At the Soil Health Conference in Guelph, in the March of 1994, a soil scientist from the University of Saskatchewan named Dr. Ivan Lowen was presenting research that had been running for 11 years on test plots near Swift Current. He had a table near the back of the conference hall with soil cores in clear plastic tubes, dark at the bottom and pale at the top, and beside them, soil cores from a no-till operation that ran almost uniformly dark from one end to the other. By 9 in the morning, most of the men at the conference had walked past his table without stopping. A few of them had made comments to each other that Dr. Lewin was accustomed to hearing by then. Dr. Ivan Lewin had been presenting this research at agricultural conferences for 7 years. He had come to Ontario twice before. He had been told by extension agents that Ontario farmers were different, that the ground was different, that what worked on the prairie didn't translate east of Sault Ste. Marie. He had been told this so many times that he had begun, privately, to consider whether it was worth making the drive from the airport again. Kathleen stopped at his table at 9:10. She asked him 4 questions. He answered them. She asked for his card. He gave it to her and watched her walk back to her seat with the data summary he'd printed on yellow paper, and he thought that she had the look of someone who was going to do something with it. What the other farmers at that conference didn't know was that Kathleen Sorrel had not come to Guelph because she heard it was a good conference. She had driven 2 hours on a Tuesday in March because she was looking for something specific, and she had been looking for it since the October of 1992, 9 months after Dennis died. Let me tell you who Kathleen was, because nothing she did next makes sense unless you understand where she came from. Kathleen was born Kathleen Auger in 1950 in Vankleek Hill, in the eastern end of Ontario, near the Quebec border. Her father, Edward Auger, had farmed 60 acres of sandy loam east of town and supplemented the income by cutting cedar posts for the telephone company in winter. Her mother, Simone, had worked the kitchen garden and kept the books for both operations in a hardcover ledger she bought at the pharmacy in Hawkesbury every January. Edward Auger was a careful man. He did not buy equipment he didn't need. He did not plant varieties he hadn't tested on a small plot first. He kept records the way other men kept grudges, thoroughly and without forgetting. Every fall he walked his fields after harvest with Kathleen beside him, and he told her things he didn't tell anyone else. He told her about the year his father had plowed the hillside field the wrong direction and lost 6 inches of topsoil to one rainstorm. He told her about the farm east of town where the owner had stripped every hedgerow to plant soybeans fence to fence, and what the field looked like 3 years later. He pointed at the ground the way other fathers pointed at maps. Kathleen kept up with him until the year she left for the University of Guelph in 1968, where she studied agriculture with the intention of coming back to the farm. She met Dennis Sorrel in her second year. He was from Huron County, quiet and steady, in the way that Huron County men often were, with a farm that was paid off and a way of listening that she found, at 19, remarkable. She married him in 1972. She moved to Blythe. She kept her father's way of walking fields, but she adapted it to Dennis's operation, which ran on a schedule Dennis had inherited from his father, which meant conventional tillage, moldboard, plow in the fall, disc and harrow in the spring, plant when the soil reached the right temperature. It was how Dennis's father had done it, and how his grandfather before that had done it. It had worked for 3 generations. Dennis saw no reason to alter it. Kathleen had a reason. She had 2 reasons. But Dennis was alive and the farm was his, and she put her reasons in the same drawer where she kept the letters from her father and the yellow coarse notes from Guelph. Dennis died in January of 1992. Kathleen was 42 years old. She had no children. Her father had died in 1988, her mother in 1990. She had a sister in Ottawa who called twice a month and meant well. She had Dennis's brother, a man named Reg Sorrel, who farmed 600 acres south of Seaforth and had been driving out to the Blythe farm every other week since the funeral, whether Kathleen asked him to or not. But it was a dry July. She spent 1992 running the farm the way Dennis had run it, because it was planting season before she had finished grieving enough to think clearly. She spent the fall of 1992 walking the fields after harvest the way her father had taught her. She walked them alone this time. She pressed the soil between her fingers. She dug with a pocket knife. She looked at what she found. What she found was not what she had been hoping to find. The topsoil on the Sorrel farm had been run under the moldboard plow for 53 consecutive years. The plow layer, the zone of loose, worked soil above the hard pan, was between 4 and 6 inches deep. Below it, the soil was compacted, pale, and tight. The earthworm counts she did herself, pressing a spade into the ground and counting what she turned up, were low. In some fields, they were very low. The organic matter percentage she had tested at the lab in Exeter came back at 2.1%. Her father's fields in Vankleek Hill had tested at 4.8 when she'd had them checked the year before he sold. She drove to the Guelph library in the November of 1992 and spent 2 days pulling every research paper she could find on soil organic matter and tillage. She came back with a box of photocopies and a list of names. Dr. Ivan Lowen's name was on that list. She wrote him a letter in December. He wrote back in January. They corresponded through 1993. She attended his conference presentation in March of 1994. And, within 48 hours of her return, Huron County had a new story to tell. Kathleen Sorrel went to a conference in Guelph and came back saying she's not going to plow anymore. Reg Sorrel heard it from the man at the co-op in Wingham before Kathleen had time to tell him herself. He drove out on a Thursday afternoon, let himself through the gate the way he always had, and found Kathleen in the machine shed, looking at the moldboard sections on the plow, with the expression of a woman who has made a decision. "Kath," he said, "what's this I'm hearing? I'm converting to no-till." Reg was 56 years old. He had farmed Huron County his whole life. He had 600 acres and a good yield history and an opinion about soil management that had been formed over 4 decades and was not especially open to revision. "You'll lose your stand," he said. "You'll have disease pressure you can't manage. You'll have compaction issues that are worse than what you've got now." "I have compaction issues now, Reg." "Kath, Dennis ran this farm for 30 years, and the topsoil is down to 5 inches, Kathleen said. His father plowed it to 6. His grandfather broke it at 7. I've been watching it go the wrong direction for 20 years, and I didn't say anything, because it wasn't my place. It's my place now." Reg took off his cap. He turned it in his hands. He had known Dennis Sorrel since they were boys sharing a bedroom in a farmhouse that no longer stood. He looked at Kathleen, and he did not see a woman who was confused. He saw something worse. He saw a woman who had made up her mind. "She's grieving," he told his wife that night. "That's what this is. Dennis has been gone 2 years, and now she's gone sideways on us." His wife, whose name was Brenda and who had more sense than Reg on most subjects, said only that Kathleen Auger had never been sideways a day in her life. But Reg didn't want to hear it. He had already decided on the story, and the story was easier. The county repeated it, at every gas station, at every fence line, at the tables in the back of the Blythe diner where the older farmers sat through the winter mornings. The widow Sorrel had lost her mind over some professor from Saskatchewan. She was going to leave the stubble on the fields and seed into it, and that was going to be a very expensive lesson in why you didn't do that. Kathleen heard about it, of course. There is no county in Ontario too large for that kind of story to travel. She said nothing. She converted the drill. The seed drill she owned was a conventional model, not built for direct seeding into residue. Converting it meant fitting coulters in front of the openers to cut through the standing stubble, adjusting the down pressure, changing the closing wheels. She did this herself in the machine shed. Over 6 weeks that winter, with Dr. Lewin's technical notes spread on the workbench and the parts catalog from the co-op open beside them. She had watched Dennis work on machinery for 20 years, and she had helped him more often than people knew. And her father had taught her that a careful person could learn any mechanical task if they were willing to read the manual and not rush the first step. She finished the conversion in February of 1994. She started spring seeding in May. The drill worked. The coulters cut through the residue without plugging. The seed went in at the right depth. The soil closed behind the openers the way it was supposed to. By June, her winter wheat was up and looked the way wheat was supposed to look. This was not something the county acknowledged. By the second year, the earthworm counts in her fields had nearly doubled. She documented this in a notebook she had bought at the drugstore in Blythe. A hardcover ledger, navy blue, the same kind her mother had kept for the farm in Vankleek Hill. By the third year, the organic matter in her fields had moved from 2.1 to 2.6%. Slow, but measurable. She had the lab in Exeter run the tests twice to confirm. By 1997, her yields were matching the county average on less input. Her herbicide bill had dropped. Her fuel bill had dropped sharply because she was running the tractor over each field once instead of 3 and 4 times. She was putting hours on the equipment at a fraction of the rate her neighbors were. The 4250, the 50 that had needed engine work the year after Dennis died, was running clean and would run for another decade at this rate. None of this was visible from the road. What was visible from the road was that Kathleen Sorrel's fields looked different. They had stubble on them in the spring. They didn't have that worked, open, clean look that Huron County fields were supposed to have. Two of the older farmers who drove past on the county road slowed down and shook their heads every spring, and one of them, a man named Alvin Prater, who had been a close friend of Dennis's father, stopped at her lane in the spring of 1996 and told her directly that the field looked like she'd given up. "I haven't given up," Kathleen said. "Kath, you've got last year's trash all over that field. That's last year's residue, Alvin. It's feeding the soil." He looked at her the way men of a certain generation looked at women who corrected them on agricultural matters. Then he got back in his truck and drove away. Kathleen went back to what she had been doing. She had been building a moisture retention profile on each of her fields using a set of soil moisture sensors she'd ordered through the university extension office, and she had been watching, month by month, what the undisturbed soil was holding compared to what the tilled fields around her were holding. The numbers were not dramatic yet. They were moving in one direction. She knew what the numbers meant. She had known since the afternoon in Guelph when she pressed Dr. Lowen's soil cores between her fingers and felt the difference in structure. A tilled soil loses its aggregates, the pore spaces that hold air and water and give roots something to move through. The plow destroys them and the soil rebuilds them slowly. And if you plow again the following fall, you never let it finish. An undisturbed soil builds on itself, slowly in the first years, then faster. It is, like most things worth building, a process that requires you to resist the urge to interfere. She had written that down in the Navy ledger. Her father's voice, not a quote from any paper. Reg came back in the fall of 1996. He had not been to the farm since a hard conversation in the spring of 1995, when Kathleen had told him she was expanding the no-till to the north quarter, the field closest to the road, the one most visible to anyone driving the 6th concession. Reg had said what he had to say, and Kathleen had listened, and then told him she was doing it anyway, and he had driven away without finishing his coffee. 16 months of silence between them. He drove up on a Wednesday morning. Kathleen was in the field, checking the wheat stand, walking the rows the way her father had walked his rows, counting tillers, pressing the soil at the base of each plant to check the moisture depth. She saw his truck on the lane. She walked back to the headland. "Reg," she said. He had his hands in his jacket pockets. He was looking past her at the field. "I had Exeter run my organic matter last week," he said. "I'm at 1.9. He said it the way a person says something they have been working up to for some time. "Mine was 2.8 in September," Kathleen said. He looked at her. He looked at the field. He took one hand out of his pocket and rubbed the back of his neck. "You're not going to say it," he said. "Say what?" "That you told me." "I didn't tell you anything, Reg. I converted my operation. That's different." He was quiet for a moment. Lawby. It was a gray October morning, the kind that comes in off Lake Huron with a weight to it, and the field was brown and still, and you could see the dark line where the residue had been building in the wheel tracks. "Dr. Lowen said he'd come out in the spring," she said. "Walk the fields with me. You could come if you want." Reg looked at her. He didn't say yes, he didn't say no. He cleared his throat and looked at the field again. "Show me those soil cores you pulled last month." She showed him. They stood at the tailgate of her truck in the gray morning, and she laid out the core samples on a sheet of cardboard, and he looked at them for a long time without saying anything. He pressed one with his thumb. He pressed the one from the cornfield, the one she'd kept as a baseline. Still under conventional tillage, still compacted at the plow layer. He pressed the core from the south field, 4 years of no-till, the pore spaces visible even to an eye that hadn't looked for them before. He pressed them both again. Dennis would have hated this, he said. But his voice had changed. No, Kathleen said. Dennis would have come around. It would have taken him a few years, but he was a careful man. Careful men come around when the numbers come around. Reg didn't answer. He looked at the cores for another minute. Then he said, "Who do I call about getting a coulter set for the 7,000? She told him. She found the parts number in the notebook right there at the tailgate, because she had written down everything from the beginning, the same way her mother had kept the books in Van Cleek Hill, the same way her father had walked the fields, because the people who had taught her had understood something that Huron County had not yet learned. You can only manage what you measure, and you can only measure if you write it down. Dr. Ivan Loewen drove from Saskatchewan to Blythe in the May of 1997 to spend 4 days on the Sorrel farm with 2 graduate students and a set of instruments he had borrowed from a colleague in Lethbridge. He took soil cores at 12 locations across 4 fields. He installed 3 additional moisture sensors. He sampled the earthworm populations using a quadrat method that took the graduate students most of an afternoon per field. He photographed the root systems of wheat plants pulled at tillering and compared them against photographs from a tilled field on the next concession, where Alvin Prater had agreed, without much enthusiasm, to let him sample. On the last evening he sat at Kathleen's kitchen table with his data and his cold coffee, and he said to her, "You have built something here that I have been trying to convince people to build for 15 years. She refilled his coffee. She did not make a ceremony of the moment. She asked him one question. "What happens in a dry year?" He told her. "The organic matter acts as a sponge. The undisturbed pore structure holds capillary water longer. The residue on the surface cuts evaporation. A tilled field under moisture stress loses surface water fast. An undisturbed field under the same stress loses it slowly. The difference in a serious drought could be the difference between a partial crop and no crop." She wrote that down. She had been writing things down in the Navy ledger since the fall of 1992. She was on her 3rd one by then. The summer of 2000 arrived without announcement, the way bad weather years in Ontario often do. The spring had been average. The rains came on schedule through April and the first half of May, and then they stopped. The wheat had gone in well. The corn was looking like a good stand, and then the sky went pale and stayed that way. June was dry. July was drier. By the middle of July, the topsoil on the county's worked fields was down to less than 2% moisture. Crops that had been neck-high were curling at the leaf edges. The corn was rolling its leaves by 9 in the morning, which is a stress response, a plant trying to reduce the surface area it exposes to the sun. The Maitland River, which ran through the southern part of the county, was the lowest it had been since 1957. The wells in some of the lighter-soiled areas to the north were pulling air. The farmers, who had expanded in the good years, who had taken on equipment notes and cash-rented additional acres when corn prices were up, were making hard decisions by the 2nd week of July. Some of them cut their corn for silage early before it could fail entirely. Some of them took crop insurance settlements on acres they hadn't seen rain on since May. A man named Vincent Holbrook in the north end of the township, sold his breeding stock and paid down the operating line because he didn't see a way to feed them through to fall. The feed mill in Clinton was selling feed at prices nobody wanted to talk about, and they were selling it in quantities that told you what kind of year it was. Alvin Prater was not in good shape. He had 720 acres, all of it under conventional tillage. All of it opened up to the sky every fall with the plow, all of it depending on the spring rains to recharge the profile. By July 15th, his corn was beyond rolling. It was firing from the bottom up, which means the plant is taking water from its own lower leaves to keep the upper leaves alive, which is the crop's last attempt at partial survival. He was hauling irrigation water from the East Pond with a pump that was 30 years old and could cover maybe 40 acres a day if nothing broke down. He had driven past Kathleen's farm 23 times since the drought settled in. He had counted. He didn't know why he was counting, except that each time he drove past, he had to make a deliberate effort to look at the road instead of the field. On the morning of July 19th, he stopped. He pulled onto the shoulder of the 6th concession, and he sat in the cab of his truck for a moment before he got out. Then he got out. He walked to the fence. He stood there. Kathleen's winter wheat had been harvested 10 days before in one of the last windows of manageable heat, and the residue from harvest was still on the ground, thick and golden. Under it, the soil was dark. You could see it in the spaces between the straw, dark and intact. Her corn in the adjacent field was green. Not lush, not ideal, but green. It was not rolling its leaves. It had some color that corn in July was supposed to have. In the low corner where the topography let a little more moisture concentrate, it was actually close to what you would have called normal. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at his own arm, resting on the top fence rail, already sweating at 8:30 in the morning, and he looked at Kathleen's corn, and he understood something he did not want to understand. He drove to his farm. He stood at his own fence and looked at his own corn. The leaves were rolled so tight they had turned gray at the tips. The bottom third of the plants were fired completely. The tassels were bleached. In the low corner of his field, where Kathleen's field had its best-looking plants, he had a wet spot where the compacted subsoil had sealed the water table off from the topsoil entirely, and the surface was cracked in a pattern he had seen before and hoped not to see again. He drove back to Kathleen's lane. He sat there for a long time. He did not go to the door. He did not honk the horn. He had driven past this farm for 6 years, had slowed down every spring with the head-shaking certainty that what she was doing was wrong, had told his neighbors she'd come around eventually, had told himself the same thing. He sat in his truck at the end of her lane and looked at her corn. She saw him from the kitchen window. She did not go out. After a while, he turned around and drove back up the 6th concession. By the end of July, word had moved through Huron County in the way that things move when people are frightened and looking for an explanation. It was a different kind of word than what had circulated in 1994. This word was quiet. It had the specific quietness of people who are reassessing something they had been certain about. Farmers started driving the 6th concession more than the 6th concession normally warranted. Some of them slowed down. A few of them stopped on the shoulder. None of them came to her door. The first person who came to her door in that drought summer, was not a neighbor. It was a woman named Deanna Chalk, who was the rural agricultural journalist for the Huron County paper, and who had been hearing about Kathleen Sorrel from the extension office for 2 years. She came on the 2nd of August with a notebook and a camera, and the specific energy of someone who has been waiting to write a particular story for a long time. She spent 3 hours with Kathleen. She walked the fields. She asked good questions. She had grown up on a farm near Exeter, and she understood what she was looking at, which meant that what Kathleen showed her landed differently than it would have for someone who had not spent their childhood watching a father check soil moisture by feel. The article ran on August 14th, 2000, across the top of the agriculture section. The headline read, "One Hullet farm is still green. Here's why." There was a photograph of Kathleen in the cornfield, looking at a plant, her hand at the base of the stalk, the green rows going behind her in both directions. To sly. There was a second photograph of the core samples on the tailgate of the truck, the dark one and the pale one side by side, which Deanna had asked her to set up and which said everything the article needed to say in the time it took to glance at it. The phone started ringing the day the paper came out, not the called. Some of the calls were from farmers in the county who wanted to ask questions they were not yet ready to ask each other. Some were from farmers in neighboring counties. A few were from people who had seen the article passed around at the grain elevator in Seaforth. She answered the ones she could. She let some go to the answering machine and returned them in the evenings. Dr. Lowen called from Saskatoon. He had been emailed a photo of the article by one of his graduate students who had grown up in Clinton. He said, "I told you it would come." Kathleen said, "I told you I'd write everything down." He laughed. He was 58 years old, and he had been trying to make this argument since his early 30s, and he had a particular laugh for the moments when he felt the argument finally gaining ground. Then he said, more quietly, "You know what made the difference this summer, in terms of what people could see?" She said she knew. She had said the same thing to Reg in the early years before he came around. No number on paper was ever going to move a Huron County farmer, because the number on paper could always be explained away, could always be attributed to some variable that was different on your farm, something unique to the soil type or the variety or the year. But a field that was green when every other field was burning, that was something you could see from the road, and you cannot explain away something you can see from the road. Between August of 2000 and the spring of 2001, 61 farms in 8 Ontario counties had someone walk the Sorrel farm. Kathleen walked them through herself, or sent them out with Dr. Lowen's data summary, or both. She answered questions at the tailgate, at the kitchen table, at the edge of the field. She did not charge anything. She did not prepare a presentation. She had the ledgers and the lab results and the yield records and the cores, and she spread them out on whatever flat surface was available and let people ask what they needed to ask. Alvin Prater came in September, 3 weeks after the article ran. He came on a Saturday morning and knocked on the door. "Kathleen," he said when she opened it. "Alvin." He had his cap in his hand. He was looking at the ground. He said, "I was wrong." She did not make him say more than that. She made him tea. They sat at the kitchen table. He was 71 years old, and he had been farming since he was a boy on his father's farm, and he had been wrong about things before, and he knew what it felt like, and he wanted to get through it without ceremony. She showed him the ledgers, all 3 of them. She showed him the entries from October of 1992, the first earthworm counts she had done alone after Dennis died, the numbers that had told her what the soil had already decided. She showed him the progression, year by year, field by field, the numbers moving slowly in one direction, and then a little faster as the organic matter built and the biology established itself. He looked at the pages for a long time. Then he said, "Dennis would have done this eventually, you know. He was a stubborn man, but he was a careful one." "I know," Kathleen said. He would have gotten there. Alvin turned the ledger pages. He stopped at the entry for July 17, 2000, soil moisture reading in the South cornfield, 5 days into the worst week of the drought. The number she had written down was 14%. She had drawn a small arrow beside it, pointing up. Around it, she had written the readings from 3 other farms she had permission to monitor, the ones where the farmers had let her install sensors as a comparison. The numbers there were between 3 and 6%. What does a corn plant need to avoid stress? Alvin asked. Over 12, she said. Preferably 15. He nodded. He looked at the 14. He looked at the numbers around it. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he asked the same question Reg had asked 4 years earlier. Who do I call about the drill? She told him. She had the number in the ledger. Kathleen Sorrel ran the farm for another 18 years after the drought of 2000. She did not expand the acreage. She did not want more land. She wanted the land she had to do what land was supposed to do, which was to build itself over time rather than diminish. By 2004, the organic matter on her oldest no-till fields had reached 4.1%. Her father's fields in Van Cleek Hill, before the sale in 1993, had tested at 4.8. She had been aiming for that number since the day she read the lab results in 1992, and she had never told anyone that. Because some benchmarks are private. In the drought of 2012, the worst Ontario had seen in a generation, she lost 8% of her corn yield. The county average that year was 31%. She retired in 2018. Her niece, a woman named Brielle Auger-Comeau, who was Kathleen's sister's youngest daughter, and who had been spending summers on the Blythe farm since she was 15, took over the operation. But it was a dry July. Brielle had a degree in environmental science from Carleton, and a directness about her that Kathleen recognized from her own mother. She had been asking questions about soil biology since she was 19 and had never required convincing about the system she was inheriting. Kathleen built a smaller house on the west side of the property. She kept the Navy ledgers in the drawer of the kitchen desk. 3 hardcover books, the same kind her mother had used in Van Cleek Hill, full from cover to cover with yield data and soil tests and earthworm counts and moisture readings, and the quiet daily record of a farm improving itself against the direction everyone expected. Dr. Lewin came to visit in 2019, the summer after she retired. He was 77 years old and had been retired himself for 4 years. He sat at the kitchen table and drank the same kind of strong coffee he always had, and he walked the fields with her for an hour, and he did not say very much, because there was not very much that needed saying. On the way back to the house, he stopped at the corner of the south field, the one she had converted first, the one Alvin Prater had once called a disappointment, and he dug with the heel of his boot until he had a small hole, and he bent down and pressed the soil. He stood up. He didn't say anything. He pressed the soil again with his thumb. "You did this," he said finally. "You gave me the data," she said. "The data existed before you found it. You're the one who found it when you needed it and did something about it. That's not the same as reading a paper." She looked at the field. The residue from the previous year was still on the surface, breaking down, feeding the soil the way it had been feeding it for 25 years. The corn Brielle had put in that spring was close to knee-high. Under it, in the dark and the cool of the undisturbed topsoil, things were happening that would not be measurable until fall, were in fact happening the way they had been happening every year since 1994, slowly and without announcement, and in a direction nobody driving the 6th concession in 1994 could have predicted. Brielle's son is 11 years old. His name is Felix. He speaks French with Kathleen when they sit on the porch in the evenings, because Kathleen learned her French in Vankleek Hill and has never entirely lost it. Felix knows the south field the way he knows the rooms of the house. He knows where the soil is darkest and where it still has a way to go. He knows the cores from 1992 and the cores from 2019 and the difference between them because Kathleen has shown him and because he asked. Last spring, Brielle let Felix drive the seeding tractor for the first time. He was 10 years old, the same age Kathleen had been the first time her father let her walk the whole farm alone and make notes in a junior notebook about what she found. Felix steered the John Deere down the first pass of the south field. The coulters cut through the residue. The seed went in behind. The soil closed. Brielle watched from the headland. She said quietly, to no one in particular, the thing that Kathleen had said to her when she handed the farm over, the thing Kathleen had written in the first ledger in November of 1992, the thing Edouard Auger had told his daughter on a cold October morning in Vankleek Hill when she was 8 years old, and the field was bare and waiting, and he pressed the soil in his hands and showed her what he meant. You can only manage what you measure, and you can only do either if you stay. 3 generations, 1 sentence. 1 farm on the 6th concession of Hullet Township that held together through 2 droughts and a half-century of neighbors telling it what it couldn't do, because a woman pressed a soil core in a conference hall in Guelph and recognized the difference between what she had been given and what she could build.